Snowflakes fell like jagged glass that November, burying ordinary homes under 6 feet of ice. Everyone laughed when Harrison dug down instead of building up, calling his dirt-covered walls a grave. Mockery quickly turned into desperate begging once temperatures plummeted and his chimney was not smoking at all. Leadville, Colorado, sits at an elevation of 10,152 feet. Up there, the air is thin, the winters are brutal, and the locals wear their survival like a badge of honor. By October, the ground is usually frozen solid, and the rhythmic sound of axes splitting logs echoes through the valley. Firewood isn't just fuel in Leadville. It is currency. It is life. When Harrison Caldwell arrived in early May, the locals immediately clocked him as a flatlander. He was a retired structural engineer from Chicago, a quiet man in his late 50s with calloused hands, silver-streaked hair, and a shadow in his eyes that suggested he carried more weight than his luggage. He bought a steep, sloped, and seemingly unusable plot of land on the edge of town, right where the wind howled the loudest off the Sawatch Range. The gossip started at the Golden Burrow Cafe before the ink on Harrison's deed was even dry. Bought the old rocky slope off Pine Street, Wyatt Miller, the owner of the local hardware store and the town's primary firewood supplier, chuckled into his coffee. Fool's gonna spend a fortune just trying to level it. Then he's gonna freeze to death when the wind comes tearing down the mountain. I give him until Thanksgiving before he's begging me for a cord of seasoned oak. But Harrison didn't bring in bulldozers to level the lot. He brought in an excavator to dig into it. For 3 weeks, the heavy machinery tore a massive, gaping hole directly into the side of the hill. It was a cavernous gouge in the earth, 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep, carving right into the bedrock and dense clay. Townspeople would slow their trucks as they drove past, shaking their heads. "What in God's name is he doing?" asked Evelyn Harper, a prominent local real estate agent and self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's aesthetics. She stood on the edge of the property line one afternoon, her designer winter coat pulled tight against the late spring chill. "Is he building a bunker? A basement? It looks like a mass grave." Harrison, covered in dust and sweat, climbed out of the pit and offered a polite but strained smile. "It's the foundation, Evelyn, and the walls." Evelyn scoffed, her breath pluming in the cold air. "You can't live underground, Harrison. You aren't a badger. You'll freeze, or the moisture will rot your lungs." "I appreciate your concern," Harrison replied softly, turning back to his work. Over the next 2 months, the mockery intensified. Instead of framing wooden walls like a normal cabin, Harrison poured massive, heavily reinforced concrete walls inside the pit. He laid miles of strange, snake-like tubing through the concrete floor. He slathered the exterior of the concrete with thick, black waterproofing tar, layered it with rigid foam insulation, and then wrapped the entire structure in heavy-duty drainage mats. The real spectacle, however, happened in late July. Wyatt Miller and a few other locals parked across the street, leaning against the bed of Wyatt's Ford F250, drinking beers and laughing as Harrison rented a bulldozer. Instead of building a roof and siding, Harrison began pushing the mountain back over the house. He buried the concrete structure under 3 feet of earth, leaving only the south-facing front exposed. From the back and the sides, the house completely disappeared into the landscape. To the uneducated eye, it looked as though Harrison had simply buried a concrete box and given up. The town dubbed it Caldwell's Cave. "Hey, Harrison!" Wyatt yelled across the road, cupping his hands over his mouth. "You forget to buy wood for the walls? I got some 2x4s on sale. Or are you planning to hibernate until spring?" Harrison didn't engage. He just methodically patted down the soil on his new roof, carefully planting native grass seed and wildflowers into the dirt. What Wyatt and the rest of Leadville didn't understand was the physics of what Harrison was doing. They saw a man burying his house in the freezing dirt. Harrison saw a thermal battery. Below the frost line, the Earth maintains a constant temperature of about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. By burying 3 sides of his home and the roof, Harrison was isolating his living space from the extreme temperature swings of the Leadville air, which could drop to 20 below zero in January. But physics wasn't the only thing driving Harrison's obsessive, grueling labor. It was a ghost. 3 years prior, Harrison had lived in a beautiful, traditional A-frame cabin in upstate New York with his wife, Sarah. They had loved the roaring fires in their cast-iron wood stove. But one night, a freak structural shift in their chimney caused a blockage. The carbon monoxide detector's battery had died 2 days prior. Harrison woke up on the floor, vomiting, his head pounding with a lethal pressure. He dragged himself to the door, gasping for air. But by the time he pulled Sarah from the bed, it was too late. The roaring fire, the traditional cabin, the reliance on burning wood. It had taken the only thing he had ever loved. He moved to Leadville not to embrace the cold, but to conquer it. He swore on Sarah's grave that he would never rely on a dangerous, unpredictable fire to keep him alive again. He was building a machine for living, a sanctuary where the cold could not reach him, and where a flame was never required. But before winter could test his engineering, the town's bureaucracy decided to test his resolve. By August, Evelyn Harper had seen enough. The cave was a blight on Pine Street, a stark contrast to the picturesque, log cabin aesthetic that kept property values high and attracted wealthy ski tourists. If she let Harrison build a dirt mound house, what was next? Shipping containers, tents. Evelyn filed a formal grievance with the county, citing visual disruption, unapproved architectural styles, and potential structural hazards. She personally drove County Inspector Richard Davies to the site, a smug smile playing on her lips. "Look at it, Richard," Evelyn said, pointing a manicured finger at the mound of dirt, which was now sprouting green grass. "It's a structural liability. One heavy snowfall, and that dirt roof is going to cave in and crush him. And there isn't a single chimney. How is he going to heat it? It violates the minimum heating requirements for a residential dwelling." Richard, a weary man who had spent 30 years inspecting poorly built additions, pulled out his clipboard and approached the front of the house. The entire south-facing wall, the only part not buried, was currently a massive, open wooden frame. Harrison stepped out of the opening, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been expecting this visit. "Mr. Caldwell," Richard said, adjusting his glasses. "We have some complaints regarding the structural integrity of your roof and your heating plan. I need to see your approved blueprints." Harrison calmly walked to a makeshift plywood table and unrolled his plans. "The roof is 10-inch thick, steel-reinforced concrete, supported by a central load-bearing spine," Harrison explained, tracing the lines with a pencil. "It's engineered to hold 3 feet of saturated soil, plus a snow load of 200 pounds per square foot. That's double the county requirement." Richard peered closely at the engineering stamps. They were flawless. "All right, but what about the heating? Code requires a permanent heating source capable of maintaining 68 degrees. I don't see a gas line trench, I don't see a propane tank, and I sure don't see a chimney." Evelyn crossed her arms triumphantly. "He thinks he can live without heat, Richard. The man is delusional." Harrison didn't look at Evelyn. He kept his eyes on the inspector. "My heating source is 93 million miles away, Richard. The sun." Harrison led them to the front of the house. "This entire south-facing facade will be triple-pane, argon-filled glass. The winter sun sits low in the southern sky. The light will pour through these windows all day long, striking the concrete floor and the rear concrete wall. The concrete acts as a thermal mass, absorbing the heat. At night, when the temperature drops, the concrete slowly releases that trapped heat back into the room. The earth surrounding the house prevents any of that heat from escaping. Richard frowned, scribbling notes. Passive solar. It's a nice concept, Mr. Caldwell, but it gets to -20 here. Sunlight and concrete aren't going to keep you from freezing to death in a blizzard. That's why I have a backup, Harrison said, pointing to the strange tubing he had embedded in the floor months ago. Hydronic radiant heat. It runs off a small electric boiler powered by solar panels I'm installing on the southern ridge. I don't need a wood stove. I don't need gas. Evelyn let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Solar panels? In a Leadville winter? You'll be begging to sleep in Wyatt's woodshed by December. Richard, you can't possibly approve this death trap. Richard hesitated. The design was highly unconventional for the area, but technically the math worked. The R-value of the Earth and insulation was astronomical. The engineering was sound. I can't red tag him, Evelyn, Richard sighed, signing the permit. He's within the legal parameters. The state allows passive solar as a primary heat source if the thermal mass calculations meet code. And his do. Evelyn stormed off, furious. Word of the confrontation spread rapidly. The town's mockery shifted from mere amusement to outright irritation. Harrison's refusal to conform, his arrogance in defying the established laws of mountain survival, rubbed the locals the wrong way. By late September, the massive, custom-ordered glass panes arrived. Harrison installed them meticulously, sealing every joint, every microscopic crack, with high-grade aerospace sealant. He installed an energy recovery ventilator, ERV, to circulate fresh air without losing heat. The house was essentially a giant, airtight thermos. As autumn bled into October, the atmosphere in Leadville grew tense. The Farmer's Almanac was predicting a winter of historical brutality. Panic buying began early. Wyatt Miller raised the price of a cord of split pine from $300 to $450, citing supply chain issues with his loggers and new state restrictions on beetle-kill timber. People grumbled, but they paid it. They had no choice. Chainsaws roared from dawn to dusk as residents frantically stacked wood against their houses, tarping the piles like precious treasure. One evening, Deputy Liam Gallagher, a young, good-natured cop who had mostly stayed out of the town's gossip, pulled his cruiser into Harrison's dirt driveway. The temperature had already dropped to 30 degrees. Liam stepped out, his breath pluming. Harrison opened his heavy, insulated front door. The warm air spilling out of the house was immediate and surprising. "Evening, Mr. Caldwell," Liam said, tipping his hat. "Just doing some community checks. The Weather Service is issuing a massive blizzard warning for next week. Early storm, a bad one. Folks are saying you still haven't bought a single log of wood. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. If you're short on cash, there are community funds." Harrison smiled, a genuine warm expression. "I appreciate you checking on me, Liam. Truly. But I don't need wood. Come inside for a moment." Liam stepped through the threshold. As the heavy door clicked shut behind him, the howling wind outside was instantly silenced. The acoustics of the earth-burned walls made the house incredibly quiet. But it was the temperature that shocked the deputy. He unzipped his heavy jacket. "It's got to be 72 degrees in here," Liam marveled, looking around the beautifully finished modern interior. Sunlight from the day had warmed the dark-stained concrete floors, and they were radiating a deep, comforting heat. "How?" "The sun," Harrison said simply, "and a little bit of dirt." Liam shook his head in disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned. You might just have the last laugh, Mr. Caldwell." "I'm not looking to laugh," Harrison said quietly, his eyes drifting to a framed photograph of Sarah on the mantelpiece. A mantelpiece without a fireplace beneath it. "I'm just looking to survive." 3 days later, the sky over Leadville turned the color of a bruised plum. The wind shifted, shrieking down from the peaks, carrying a blinding wall of white. It wasn't just a storm. It was an atmospheric river of ice and snow that would lock the town in a frozen chokehold for weeks, testing not just Harrison's engineering, but the sanity and survival of everyone who had mocked him. The storm did not arrive with a gentle dusting. It slammed into the Saguache Range with the concussive force of a freight train, a relentless, roaring beast of whiteout conditions and plummeting barometric pressure. The meteorologists in Denver called it a bomb cyclone, but the residents of Leadville simply called it a nightmare. Within the first 12 hours, the snowfall surpassed 3 feet. The wind howled at 70 miles per hour, creating drifts that swallowed cars whole and buried front porches up to the second-story windows. By the second evening, the temperature gauge outside the Golden Borough Cafe read 32 degrees below zero. Then, the power grid snapped. A massive transmission tower on Fremont Pass gave way under the weight of accumulated ice, plunging the entire county into darkness. The hum of refrigerators, the glow of streetlights, and, most critically, the blower motors on forced air furnaces all died simultaneously. Panic set in rapidly. In Evelyn Harper's sprawling, 6,000-square-foot luxury home on Pine Street, the silence of the power outage was deafening. Her house, with its gorgeous 30-foot vaulted ceilings and massive picture windows, was an architectural masterpiece and a thermal disaster. Without the propane furnace blowing hot air, the heat rose into the cavernous ceiling and vanished. The cold radiated through the expensive double-pane glass like an invasive, physical presence. She lit a fire in her grand stone fireplace, but the updraft pulled what little ambient heat remained in the room right up the chimney. By dawn on the third day, the water in her dog's bowl in the kitchen was frozen solid. Down in the valley, Wyatt Miller was fighting a losing battle. He had 300 cords of wood in his commercial lot, but the bomb cyclone had brought a cruel twist. 2 hours of freezing rain before the snow began. His massive piles of seasoned oak and pine were encased in 4 inches of bulletproof ice, buried under another 5 feet of snow. His front-end loaders wouldn't start. The diesel fuel in the lines had gelled in the extreme cold. Residents who had purchased wood were burning through their supplies at an alarming rate, tossing log after log into stoves that struggled to fight the negative 38-degree air seeping through their timber-framed walls. Mayor Kenneth Bradley declared a state of emergency over a battery-operated radio broadcast, urging residents to shelter in place and consolidate their families into single rooms to conserve body heat. But a mile up the road, completely invisible beneath a mountainous snowdrift, Harrison Caldwell was sitting in his shirt sleeves, drinking a cup of pour-over coffee. Inside the earth-bermed house, the apocalypse raging outside felt like a silent movie playing on a distant screen. The heavy, triple-pane argon glass of his south-facing wall remained perfectly clear, framing the swirling white chaos. The snow had blown directly over his house, using the aerodynamic slope of the dirt roof as a ramp. Instead of crushing the structure, the accumulated snow acted as a second, massive blanket of insulation. The temperature inside his living room was a stable, unwavering 68 degrees. During the brief, gray daytime hours, ambient ultraviolet light penetrated the storm clouds and the glass, striking the dark concrete floors. The concrete, a massive thermal battery, soaked up the energy. At night, It gently released that heat back into the sealed, insulated environment. The hydronic floor tubes circulated water, warmed by a highly efficient, insulated solar water heater on the roof. Powered by a bank of lithium-ion batteries, he kept charged through a small, wind-powered turbine he had erected behind the berm. Harrison sat by the window, stroking his thumb over the edge of his coffee mug. He should have felt vindicated. He should have felt a smug sense of satisfaction. Instead, he felt a creeping dread. He knew the physics of traditional homes. He knew how quickly a poorly insulated timber frame would surrender to 38 below. He looked at the photograph of Sarah on the mantel, remembering the suffocating panic, the biting cold of that night in New York. He couldn't just sit here. By the morning of the fourth day, the situation in Leadville had escalated from a dire emergency to a cascading catastrophe. Dispatcher Brenda Collins sat in the darkened county sheriff's office, her heavy winter coat zipped to her chin, operating the emergency radio on fading backup batteries. Her voice, normally a pillar of calm, trembled as she broadcasted the latest, devastating update. The massive flat roof of the high school gymnasium, the town's primary emergency shelter, had suffered a partial structural collapse under the immense weight of the wet snow and ice. The 200 shivering residents, huddled inside, had been evacuated to the adjacent unheated hallways, but the boiler was dead, and the ambient temperature inside the brick building was plunging toward zero. Out in the whiteout, Deputy Liam Gallagher was fighting a losing war of attrition. He had been operating his modified, tracked snowcat for 48 hours straight, his eyes bloodshot and burning from snow blindness. The heater in the cab was barely taking the edge off the freezing air. His radio crackled with Brenda's frantic voice, directing him toward the commercial Firewood lot. Liam forced the snowcat through 4-foot drifts, the diesel engine groaning in protest. When he reached Wyatt Miller's property, the scene was grim. Wyatt's massive industrial woodshed, a timber-framed structure meant to keep his premium split oak dry, had buckled. A massive accumulation of ice had snapped the central ridge beam like a dry twig. Liam waded into the wreckage, sweeping his high-powered flashlight through the swirling snow. He found Wyatt pinned beneath a massive splintered support beam, surrounded by hundreds of cords of the very firewood he had mocked Harrison for not buying. The irony was suffocating. Wyatt's face was a ghostly, waxen white, his lips a bruised shade of violet. He was clutching a frozen piece of oak to his chest in a state of deep, delirious hypothermia. Working frantically, Liam used the snowcat's heavy-duty hydraulic winch to lift the shattered beam just enough to drag Wyatt free. The wood supplier's legs were bruised but unbroken. However, his core temperature was dangerously low, and his ungloved hands were stiff and blue with advanced frostbite. Liam hauled him into the back of the snowcat, throwing thermal blankets over his trembling body. "We need a fire," Wyatt mumbled incoherently, his teeth clicking together with a sickening rhythm. "I have so much wood." "The wood is frozen solid, Wyatt, and so are you," Liam shouted over the roaring wind, slamming the heavy cab door shut. Before Liam could attempt the treacherous drive toward the compromised high school, his radio flared again. Evelyn Harper's neighbors had reported hearing a massive crash from her property. Liam rerouted the snowcat, crawling up Pine Street. Evelyn's sprawling, 6,000-square-foot luxury home, once the crown jewel of the neighborhood, looked like a shipwreck. The sheer aerodynamic pressure of the howling blizzard had exploited a microscopic flaw in one of her massive 30-foot vaulted picture windows. The glass had shattered inward, instantly depressurizing the house and inviting the bomb cyclone directly into her living room. Liam kicked through the remains of the front door, slipping on hardwood floors that were now a skating rink of black ice. He found Evelyn curled beneath a grand piano, wrapped in a sodden, frozen-down comforter. The snow was literally drifting against her antique furniture. She was entirely unresponsive, her breathing incredibly shallow. Liam scooped her up, carrying her out to the snowcat and laying her beside the semi-conscious Wyatt. The engine of the transport vehicle was beginning to sputter. The diesel fuel was starting to gel in the negative 38-degree air. The high school was 3 miles away, compromised, and freezing. The hospital's backup generators had just failed. There was nowhere left to go. Then Liam looked up toward the edge of town, toward the steep slope where the wind howled the loudest. He remembered the impossible 72-degree air hitting his face just days ago. "Hold on back there!" Liam yelled, throwing the snowcat into gear. The drive to Harrison Caldwell's property was completely blind. The topography of the land had been erased by 10-foot snowdrifts. Liam navigated purely by memory, terrified he would drive the heavy tracks right over the top of Harrison's buried roof. Suddenly, cutting through the dense, swirling white chaos, Liam saw it. A faint, golden rectangle of light. It was the south-facing glass of the earth-bermed home. Because Harrison had engineered the roof with a slight aerodynamic overhang and tilted the glass slightly outward, the violent winds had scoured the windows completely clean. The house wasn't just surviving the storm, it was comfortably sitting out the apocalypse. Liam slammed the snowcat into park and dragged Wyatt and Evelyn through the waist-deep powder, hammering his heavy frozen fists against the triple-pane glass door. Instantly, the heavy door swung inward. Harrison stood there, perfectly calm, wearing a light sweater. The blast of warm air that rushed out of the doorway hit Liam with the force of a physical blow. It was thick, silent, and radiated a profound, life-saving heat. "Help me," Liam gasped, his legs giving out. Harrison rushed forward, grabbing Wyatt by the shoulders and pulling him into the airlock-style entryway. Together, they dragged Evelyn inside and sealed the heavy door. The moment the latches clicked shut, the deafening roar of the blizzard vanished. The acoustics of the thick concrete and the thousands of tons of earth surrounding them reduced the storm of the century to a muted, distant whisper. Liam collapsed against the mudroom wall, ripping off his frozen mask and gasping for the warm, 68-degree air. He watched in stunned silence as Harrison immediately went to work. The older man dragged thick, comfortable mattresses onto the dark-stained concrete floor right in the center of the living room. As Harrison laid Wyatt on the floor, the wood supplier's eyes fluttered open. Wyatt pressed his frost-bitten, agonizingly cold hands flat against the concrete. His eyes widened in absolute shock. The floor was actively, deeply warm. The hydronic tubing embedded in the slab was still slowly circulating water that had been heated by the solar array days prior, powered by the quiet hum of Harrison's backup battery bank. Even without the active water circulation, the immense thermal mass of the earth and the concrete was stubbornly holding on to the heat it had absorbed all autumn. "It's warm," Wyatt wept, tears spilling hot tracks down his freezing cheeks. He looked up at the ceiling, expecting to see a roaring fire, but saw only the smooth, quiet expanse of concrete. "There's no fire. How is there no fire?" Evelyn, slowly regaining consciousness as the radiant heat penetrated her frozen clothes, looked around the beautifully finished, brilliantly illuminated room. The emergency LED lights cast a soft glow over the space. It wasn't a cave, it wasn't a grave, it was an impenetrable fortress of warmth. She looked at Harrison, the man she had reported to the county, the man she had mocked mercilessly in the diner. Harrison wasn't looking at them with triumph. He was looking at the framed photograph of his late wife, Sarah, resting on the shelf. The ghost that had driven him to dig a hole in the side of a mountain had finally been laid to rest. He had built a sanctuary where the cold could never reach them, and where a dangerous, unpredictable flame was never required to keep human beings alive. "You don't need a fire, Wyatt," Harrison said softly, draping a dry, heated blanket over the shivering man's shoulders. "You just need to know when to stop fighting the mountain and let it hold you instead." When the blizzard broke, Leadville was forever changed. Harrison Caldwell went from town fool to quiet savior, proving that true resilience isn't about fighting nature with fire, but embracing its reliable constants. By burying his house to escape a deeply tragic past, he ultimately unearthed a warmer, remarkably safer future for himself and the humbled neighbors who once mocked his simple dirt roof and his profound, unyielding vision of survival.